I'm going to miss the boat," she said quietly, her bravado slipping for a second. "The boat will be here when you get back," Ginny promised. "And so will I. The Fran isn't going anywhere." The day they drove to the ferry terminal was overcast, the sea a flat, industrial gray. Sandy and Tosh were there to see her off, a small gathering of the people who had become her extended family. Sandy looked healthier than he had in months. The work in the forest on the mainland had given him a new perspective, and he spoke of the trees with a reverence that Jimmy found moving. "Take care of him, Tosh," Cassie whispered as she hugged the sergeant. "He gets lonely when he thinks I'm not looking." "I'll keep him busy," Tosh promised, her eyes shimmering. "There's always another body, unfortunately." As the North Link ferry pulled away from the pier, Jimmy stood at the edge of the water until the massive white hull vanished into the fog. He felt a hollow ache in his chest, a familiar companion, but one that felt sharper today. The house would be silent tonight. Chapter 27, The Granite Heart. Autumn arrived with a ferocity that caught the islands by surprise. Gale-force winds lashed the coast, and the peat moors turned a deep, rusty brown. Jimmy immersed himself in work, but the atmosphere in Lerwick remained tense. The Lunstead Archive had been safely moved to the National Records of Scotland in Edinburgh, but its shadow still loomed over the local council. The debate centered on the War Memorial. A petition had been started to remove the names of the collaborators, the unseen threads that had been exposed. It was a polarizing issue. To some, the memorial was a sacred space that should only honor the untarnished. To others, removing the names was an attempt to sanitize history. "We can't just pretend they weren't there, Jimmy," Vicky from the museum said as they sat in the small cafe overlooking the harbor. "They were our neighbors, our cousins. If we remove them, we forget the lesson. We forget that evil isn't always a stranger from across the sea. Sometimes it's the man who sells you your bread." "People want a simple story, Vicky," Jimmy replied. "They want heroes and villains. They don't want to think about the gray areas. They don't want to think about why a man might betray his friends to save his own children." Jimmy was called to a town hall meeting that turned ugly. Arguments broke out in the aisles, and for a moment, it felt as though the old feuds of the Wilsons and the Haldanes were being reborn in a new, more political form. He stood up at the back of the room, his voice calm but commanding. "This memorial is for the dead," he said, and the room fell silent. "It's a record of a time that tested every soul on these islands. If we start editing it now, we're not honoring the heroes. We're just hiding our own shame. Let the names stay. Let them be a reminder that we must always be better than the worst of our history." The petition was eventually dropped, but the bitterness lingered. Jimmy realized that the red bones had been buried, but the granite heart of the community was still healing. Chapter 28, The Bergen Connection. In November, a letter arrived for Jimmy at the station. It wasn't from the mainland or from Cassie. It was from Norway. The sender was a woman named Sigrid, a researcher at the Bergen Maritime Museum. Dear Inspector Perez, it read, I have been following the news of the Lundstedt archive with great interest. My great-uncle was one of the agents who worked with Per Lundstedt. He died in 1945, but he left behind a diary that we have only recently deciphered. It mentions a third person involved in the Bresse operation, someone the British authorities never knew about. A woman. Jimmy felt a jolt of adrenaline. He called Sigrid immediately. She was known only as the Weaver. Sigrid explained over the phone. She was a local Shetlander who acted as the primary courier between the bus agents and the resistance in Bergen. According to my great-uncle, she was the one who actually carried the gold, not Lundstedt. He was the distraction. Do you have a name? Jimmy asked, his mind racing. Only a first name, Elspeth, and a description. She lived in a croft with a view of the lighthouse. Jimmy hung up and went straight to the archives. Elspeth. There were dozens of Elspeths in the records from that era, but a croft with a view of the lighthouse. He drove to the southern tip of the island, where the Sumberg Head Lighthouse stood guard over the roost. There were only a few old ruins in that area. He walked through the heather, the wind whipping his coat, until he found a small stone foundation nearly swallowed by the earth. He knelt down and began to clear away the dead grass. He wasn't looking for gold or bones this time. He was looking for a sign. And then he saw it. Carved into the cornerstone of the ruin was a small, delicate image of a loom. The Weaver, Jimmy whispered. Chapter 29, The Loom of History. The discovery of Elspeth's identity changed everything. She hadn't been a collaborator. She had been a shadow agent, working at a level of secrecy that even the bus captains hadn't fully understood. She had survived the war and lived a quiet, solitary life in Lerwick, dying in the 1970s without ever revealing her role. Jimmy tracked down her remaining effects, a single trunk stored in a solicitor's attic. Inside were not gold sovereigns, but letters. Hundreds of them. They were from the families of the agents she had helped escape the people who had survived because of her. She was the true guardian, Jimmy told Tosh as they sat in the office, surrounded by the yellowed papers. She saw the betrayal. She saw the murder of Lundstedt, and she chose to stay silent because she knew the truth would destroy the resistance effort. She carried that weight alone until the day she died. The letters were published as a supplement to the Lundstedt archive. They didn't erase the names of the collaborators, but they provided a counterpoint, a story of quiet, unacknowledged heroism that resonated deeply with the islanders. The vandalism at the nature reserve stopped. The trader's gold graffiti was replaced by a small, bronze plaque at the entrance dedicated to the Weaver. Chapter 30, The Blue Boat's Journey. Winter returned to Shetland with a quiet grace. The first snow fell in December, dusting the peat moors in a blanket of white. Jimmy took the Fran out into the bay one last time before the harbor iced over. The sea was a deep, crystalline blue, and the air was so sharp it felt like breathing glass.